December 12, 1944, Schloss Falkenstein, Western Germany. Oberst Ingrid von Steinbach's fountain pen scratched across the operational map as she marked the Ardennes sector with a confident stroke of green ink, the color reserved for secure zones. "The Americans will never bring armor through that wilderness," she wrote in her private assessment to Berlin. 70 miles of impassable forest, gorges, and winter storms. Even if they tried, we would have weeks to respond. Within 72 hours, the thunderous roar of Sherman tanks would shatter not just the morning silence of the Ardennes, but every assumption the German High Command held about American tactical capabilities in winter warfare. The confidence radiating from Wehrmacht headquarters that December morning was built on what seemed like unshakable military logic. For 3 years, German commanders had studied the Ardennes Forest, analyzing every ridge, every stream, every winding logging road through the lens of conventional military wisdom. Their conclusion was unanimous. This sector represented nature's own fortress, impregnable to mechanized warfare. Oberst Ingrid von Steinbach, chief intelligence officer for Heeresgruppe Mittel, had personally surveyed the region in October 1944. A decorated veteran of the Eastern Front and one of the Wehrmacht's few female field-grade officers, von Steinbach had earned her position through meticulous analysis and an uncanny ability to predict enemy movements. Her report on the Ardennes, filed with characteristic precision, became the foundation for German defensive planning across the entire western sector. The Waldberg terrain consists of 70 miles of dense forest, steep valleys, and narrow roads unsuitable for armored operations, von Steinbach wrote in her comprehensive assessment. Winter conditions will render vehicle movement virtually impossible. Stream crossings limited to medieval bridges with unknown load capacity. Maximum threat assessment, light infantry reconnaissance only. Recommend minimal garrison with primary defenses focused on Rhineland approaches. The mathematics seemed irrefutable to von Steinbach's analytical mind. The Waldberg Forest contained over 400 square miles of woodland, where the canopy blocked 85% of available light even in summer. In December, with shortened days and snow-laden branches, visibility would drop to mere yards. The logging roads, originally cut for horse-drawn carts in the previous century, averaged just 12 feet in width, barely sufficient for a single tank, impossible for the side-by-side formations American armor doctrine required for effective advance. Stream crossings represented the most critical bottleneck. Von Steinbach's survey identified exactly 19 stone bridges spanning the various waterways that cut through the forest. Most had been constructed in the 1800s for civilian traffic, with load capacities that were optimistically estimated but certainly inadequate for 35-ton Sherman tanks loaded with ammunition and fuel. The bridges at Hohenfels, Waldmünchen, and Bergfried were particularly narrow, forcing any advancing column into single file across spans that could be demolished with minimal explosive charges. General Major Margarethe Hoffmann, commander of the 47th Reserve Division and another of the Wehrmacht's rare female generals, shared von Steinbach's assessment completely. Hoffmann had distinguished herself during the retreat from Stalingrad, where her impromptu defensive positions had saved thousands of German soldiers from encirclement. Her expertise in defensive warfare made her opinion particularly valued by High Command. In a conference at the remote castle of Berg Altenstein on November 28, 1944, Hoffmann addressed the assembled staff officers with characteristic directness. Colleagues, we have fought the Americans from the Norman beaches to the Rhine approaches. They excel in open terrain with overwhelming material superiority and coordination between ground and air forces. But winter warfare in confined mountain terrain, this requires improvisation, individual initiative, and adaptation to chaos. These are demonstrably not American tactical strengths. Hoffman's analysis was supported by extensive intelligence about American operational doctrine gathered from captured field manuals, prisoner interrogations, and battlefield observation. U.S. Army tactics emphasized combined arms operations, requiring precise coordination between tanks, artillery, infantry, and close air support. Such operations demanded clear sight lines for observation, reliable radio communications across multiple units, and sufficient maneuvering space for flanking movements. The Waldberg offered none of these tactical advantages. The American preference for overwhelming firepower before advancing also seemed to work against them. In forest terrain, artillery effectiveness dropped dramatically when targets were concealed by dense tree cover. Air support became nearly impossible when friendly and enemy forces were separated by mere hundreds of yards in limited visibility. Tank formations lost their primary advantage of mutual support when forced into narrow columns on single-track roads.
British Wehrmacht meteorologists provided additional scientific support for German confidence in their defensive assessment. Weather reports predicted the harshest winter in a decade, with temperatures expected to drop to -15 degrees Fahrenheit by late December, and snowfall accumulations exceeding 4 feet by January. Historical records showed that even German mountain divisions, specifically trained and equipped for alpine warfare, had struggled with winter operations in similar terrain during peacetime exercises. Oberst Clara Dietrich, who had commanded Gebirgsjäger units in Norway and the Caucasus, offered her professional assessment based on extensive mountain warfare experience. American forces have shown no capacity for winter mountain operations, Dietrich noted in her tactical evaluation. Their equipment is designed for temperate conditions, their supply systems for accessible terrain, their tactical doctrine for conventional battlefield geometry. Even if they attempted an advance through the Waldberg, the first major snowstorm would freeze their vehicles, scatter their formations, and leave them isolated and helpless. The strategic implications seemed crystal clear to German high command. The Waldberg sector could be adequately defended by minimal forces. Aging reservists from fortress battalions, young recruits from training divisions, and a small cadre of experienced non-commissioned officers to provide leadership. The genuine American offensive would certainly come through the Aachen corridor or across the Rhine plains, where their superior materiel could be deployed effectively according to their established tactical preferences. This calculated dismissal of American winter warfare capabilities reflected a broader German misconception about their enemy that had developed throughout 1944. Wehrmacht intelligence had focused intensively on documenting American industrial capacity and material advantages, while consistently underestimating American tactical adaptability and innovation under adverse conditions. German staff officers observed American reliance on overwhelming firepower and sophisticated logistic systems, then concluded this indicated tactical inflexibility and dependence on perfect conditions. They noted American preferences for prepared positions with extensive engineering support and interpreted this as fundamental inability to improvise or adapt when circumstances changed rapidly. They documented American success in conventional operations and assumed this meant failure was inevitable in unconventional situations. General Major Hoffman embodied this analytical framework in her assessment of American tactical psychology. A veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, Hoffman had earned her reputation through successful defensive operations against numerically superior forces. In her professional estimation, Americans fought like they're industrial machines, efficiently and effectively when everything functioned according to specifications, but helplessly when forced to deviate from standard operating procedures. The Americans achieved victory through industrial and material superiority, Hoffman noted in her division diary entry for December 10th. Strip away their technological advantages, force them to fight on unfamiliar ground in harsh conditions with limited visibility and restricted communications, and they become ordinary soldiers. Perhaps less than ordinary, given their relative inexperience in sustained combat compared to our veterans who have survived 4 years of total warfare. This assessment contained a critical analytical flaw that would soon prove catastrophic. German commanders were measuring American capabilities against their own tactical preferences and cultural assumptions, while systematically ignoring mounting evidence of American adaptability that contradicted their theories. Recent intelligence reports from Normandy described American units rapidly modifying their standard equipment for unexpected hedgerow fighting, developing new tactics within days of encountering unfamiliar conditions. Similar reports from the Ardennes Forest documented American engineers constructing corduroy roads through supposedly impassable terrain, enabling armored operations in conditions German doctrine declared impossible. Radio intercepts had revealed American commanders implementing tactical innovations and equipment modifications within hours of encountering new battlefield problems, showing a flexibility that German military culture found difficult to comprehend or accept. However, these warning signs were consistently dismissed by German intelligence analysts as isolated exceptions rather than evidence of systematic American tactical flexibility. German confidence in Waldberg impregnability remained unshaken because it fitted perfectly with their theoretical understanding of how warfare should function according to established military principles. Oberst von Steinbach's intelligence network had been tracking American force dispositions for weeks without detecting any unusual activity that might suggest offensive preparations. American positions appeared static and defensive, their patrol patterns routine and predictable, their radio traffic following normal administrative procedures. Aerial reconnaissance flights over American rear areas showed typical supply depot activity, with no unusual concentrations of fuel, ammunition, or bridging equipment that would indicate major offensive operations. The German assessment was further reinforced by their understanding of American military culture and decision-making processes. German intelligence believed American commanders were institutionally cautious, preferring to attack only when they possessed overwhelming superiority in men and materiel. Winter conditions in difficult terrain seemed to eliminate these preferred conditions, making a major American offensive highly unlikely, according to German analysis.
Moreover, German commanders assumed that American public opinion and political leadership would not support costly offensive operations during winter months, when defensive positions offered clear advantages. The approaching Christmas season seemed particularly unfavorable for American morale and unit cohesion, as German intelligence reports consistently emphasized American soldiers' supposed homesickness and lack of commitment to extended combat operations. Colonel Frieda Brenner, whose 23rd Intelligence Battalion specialized in analyzing Allied communications, had intercepted numerous American letters and personal communications expressing war weariness and desire to return home for the holidays. These intercepts seemed to confirm German assumptions about American psychological vulnerability to prolonged combat stress, particularly in harsh conditions far from home. American soldiers write constantly of home, family, and civilian life, Brenner noted in her weekly intelligence summary. Their emotional attachment to peacetime comfort makes them particularly vulnerable to the hardships of winter mountain warfare. German soldiers, hardened by 4 years of total war, possess psychological advantages that become decisive when material superiority is neutralized by terrain and weather. The forest itself seemed to validate German defensive confidence.
Dense stands of pine and oak created natural obstacles that would channel any attacking force into predictable corridors where defensive fires could be concentrated. The steep valleys and ridgelines provided excellent observation positions for German defenders while concealing their exact positions from advancing enemies. Ancient hunters' paths and logging trails, known intimately by local German guides but unmarked on American maps, offered opportunities for counterattacks and flanking movements that could devastate confused enemy columns. German engineers had spent months preparing the Waldberg's defenses with characteristic thoroughness. Bridge demolition charges were positioned and tested at all major crossing points. Roadblocks constructed from felled trees were positioned at natural choke points, where enemy engineers would have maximum difficulty clearing them. Observation posts connected by buried telephone lines provided communication networks independent of radio transmissions that could be intercepted or jammed. The defensive scheme reflected German engineering at its most sophisticated. Rather than attempting to hold linear positions that could be overwhelmed by superior numbers, German defenders were positioned to create multiple killing zones that would fragment any advancing force into isolated units that could be defeated piecemeal. Each defensive position was designed to channel attackers towards secondary positions where concentrated fire could destroy them systematically. Ammunition and supply caches were distributed throughout the forest, positioned to support sustained defensive operations even if primary supply routes were cut. Medical aid stations were established in caves and reinforced bunkers that could continue functioning under artillery bombardment. Command posts were located in positions that provided both concealment and communication with higher headquarters, ensuring coordinated defensive responses to any threat. The overall German assessment created a picture of tactical invulnerability that seemed unassailable to military logic. Natural terrain obstacles would channel American forces into killing zones. Winter weather would degrade American equipment and morale while favoring German defenders operating from prepared positions. Limited visibility would neutralize American advantages in air support and long-range artillery observation. Restricted mobility would prevent American armor from exploiting breakthroughs or conducting the rapid exploitation that characterized their successful operations in more favorable terrain. As December 12 dawned across the Waldberg Forest, German observation posts reported completely normal Allied activity throughout their assigned sectors. American positions appeared static and routine, with no indications of the massive preparations that would be necessary for major offensive operations. The forest remained quiet, except for the whisper of wind through snow-laden branches and the occasional crack of ice-covered tree limbs adjusting to temperature changes. In her final intelligence assessment before the storm, Oberst von Steinbach wrote with the confidence of a professional who had never been fundamentally wrong in her tactical predictions. American forces show no indication of major offensive operations, weather conditions deteriorating precisely as meteorological services predicted. Our defensive assumptions remain completely valid based on all available evidence. The Waldberg sector continues secure and requires no reinforcement of current minimal garrison forces. The trap was set perfectly, but not in the way German commanders imagined. Their certainty about American tactical limitations and cultural weaknesses would soon encounter the reality of American innovation, determination, and the kind of institutional flexibility that transformed supposed disadvantages into devastating tactical advantages. The Waldberg Forest, which German planners viewed as their natural fortress and unassailable defensive position, was about to become the stage for one of the most shocking reversals in modern military history.
The British warmen's most skilled female officers didn't understand was that while they had been studying traditional military theory and conventional tactical doctrine, the Americans had been studying practical problems and developing unconventional solutions. And in the depths of that seemingly impassable wilderness, American ingenuity and institutional adaptability were about to collide with German theoretical assumptions in ways that would leave the entire German defensive strategy in ruins. shattering not just their tactical positions, but their fundamental understanding of what modern warfare could accomplish under impossible conditions. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m., Waldberg Forest. The first sound that shattered Oberst von Steinbach's certainty wasn't the expected crack of small arms fire or the distant rumble of artillery. It was something impossible, the deep mechanical growl of tank engines echoing through the forest darkness where no tanks could possibly operate. At her command post in the reinforced bunker beneath Schloss Falkenstein, von Steinbach jerked awake to frantic radio transmissions crackling through the pre-dawn silence. "Vixen Control, this is Hawk 7, came the panicked voice of Lieutenant Eva Weber from Observation Post Bergfried. "Multiple engine sounds approaching from the west, heavy vehicles, but that's impossible in this terrain." Von Steinbach's trained mind immediately rejected what she was hearing. Her meticulous terrain analysis had proven beyond doubt that armored vehicles couldn't traverse the narrow logging roads, couldn't cross the ancient bridges, couldn't navigate in zero visibility through dense forest. Yet the radio reports kept coming, each one more impossible than the last. "Vixen Control, this is Wolf 3, transmitted Feldwebel Maria Kruger from the southern sector. "Sir, I can hear tracked vehicles moving through the Tannenhain Valley, multiple units, coordinated movement. But our intelligence showed no roads suitable for—" The transmission cut to static as the sound of gunfire erupted in the background. General Major Hofmann arrived at von Steinbach's bunker within minutes, her usually immaculate uniform hastily thrown over winter clothing. The two women stared at the tactical map where red pins marked each impossible report of American armor moving through terrain they had declared impassable. "This cannot be happening," Hofmann muttered, tracing the reported American movements with her finger. "Look at these positions. The Americans would have needed to move tanks across streams, through forests, up gradients that exceed their mechanical capabilities. Our calculations were precise." But the radio reports continued with increasing urgency. At 6:15 a.m., Oberst Clara Dittrich's voice crackled through from her mountain warfare observation post. "Command, the Americans have somehow gotten Sherman tanks to within 800 meters of checkpoint Waldmünchen. I repeat, Sherman tanks, in this terrain. I can see their headlights through the trees." Von Steinbach felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. She had built her reputation on being right, on understanding enemy capabilities better than they understood themselves. Every promotion, every decoration, every moment of professional respect had come from her ability to predict and prepare for enemy actions. Now, reality was contradicting everything she knew to be true. The morning light revealed the full scope of the catastrophe. American forces hadn't just penetrated the Waldberg Forest, they had done so with equipment modifications and tactical innovations that German intelligence had never imagined possible. Through her field glasses, von Steinbach watched Sherman tanks fitted with steel teeth cutting through fallen trees like monstrous mechanical beasts. American engineers had somehow constructed temporary bridges across streams in complete darkness, allowing 35-ton vehicles to cross spans that German calculations had deemed impossible. "They've modified everything," whispered Colonel Brenner, her face pale as she studied intelligence reports flooding in from surviving observation posts. "Track extenders to reduce ground pressure, waterproof engine modifications for stream fording, infrared equipment for night navigation. Sir, they've essentially rebuilt their tanks for forest warfare." The Americans weren't fighting according to any doctrine German intelligence had studied. Instead of the expected combined arms operations requiring perfect coordination, they were advancing in small, independent groups that adapted instantly to terrain obstacles. When roads proved too narrow, American tanks simply created new paths, pushing aside trees that German planners had assumed would stop them. When bridges couldn't support their weight, American engineers constructed bypasses in hours rather than days German doctrine suggested such operations required. Most devastating of all was the realization that the Americans had been preparing for exactly this operation while German intelligence detected nothing unusual. The equipment modifications, the specialized training, the tactical adaptations, all had been developed specifically to overcome the obstacles that German commanders had considered insurmountable. By 10 a.m., German defensive positions throughout the Waldberg were reporting breakthrough after breakthrough. The carefully planned killing zones became death traps for the defenders as American forces appeared from directions that should have been impossible. The ammunition caches, positioned to support sustained defense against predictable attack routes, became useless as Americans bypassed established positions entirely.
British. General Major Hoffman's final radio transmission came at 11:30 a.m. as American forces overran her command post. All units, this is Marguerite Hoffman. We were wrong about everything. The Americans, they've rewritten the rules of winter warfare. They're not fighting our kind of war. They're fighting a war we never imagined was possible. Von Steinbach stood alone in her bunker as the sounds of American tanks grew closer, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports that had become monuments to catastrophic miscalculation. The forest that was supposed to protect them had become a highway for American innovation. The winter conditions that should have stopped enemy operations had been transformed into tactical advantages through American engineering ingenuity. In her final diary entry before evacuation, von Steinbach wrote, with the bitter precision of a professional acknowledging complete failure, "We studied the terrain and declared it impassable. The Americans studied the problem and made it possible. We analyzed their doctrine and predicted their limitations. They abandoned doctrine and eliminated limitations. We prepared to fight the war we understood. They brought a war we never conceived could exist." The Waldberg Forest, transformed from German fortress to American highway in a single morning, stood as testament to a fundamental truth about warfare that no amount of theoretical planning could overcome. Military genius lay not in perfect analysis of existing conditions, but in the ability to change those conditions entirely. The Americans hadn't been defeated by impossible terrain because they had refused to accept that anything was impossible. As von Steinbach evacuated her command post, she could hear the sound of American tanks moving freely through the forest that was supposed to stop them, carrying crews who had proven that the only true military limitation was the failure to imagine solutions. The most complete German defeat hadn't come from superior numbers or better equipment, but from superior thinking applied to problems that German commanders had declared unsolvable. The Battle of Waldberg was over before it had truly begun, decided not by courage or firepower, but by the collision between rigid certainty and infinite adaptability. The Americans had won by refusing to fight the war Germany expected, instead creating entirely new possibilities for what warfare could accomplish when genius met determination in the depths of an impossible forest. March 1947. Nuremberg Tribunal Documentation Center. Former Oberst Ingrid von Steinbach sat across from American interrogator Captain Sarah Mitchell, her once confident bearing replaced by the quiet humility of someone whose professional certainty had been shattered beyond repair. The maps and intelligence reports from the Waldberg operation lay spread between them, documents that had become evidence not of military failure, but of a fundamental misunderstanding of what warfare could become. "We studied the terrain and declared it impassable," von Steinbach said quietly, her voice carrying none of the authority that once commanded respect throughout Wehrmacht intelligence circles. "We calculated load capacities, measured road widths, studied weather patterns. We believed knowledge of these factors would determine the outcome. We were studying the wrong variables entirely." Captain Mitchell, herself a veteran of the Waldberg breakthrough, nodded with understanding rather than triumph. She had witnessed firsthand the German confusion as American forces accomplished what German doctrine declared impossible. "Your analysis wasn't wrong about the terrain," she acknowledged. "It was wrong about human adaptability. You calculated what was, but we imagined what could be." The psychological transformation of Germany's military leadership following the Waldberg defeat extended far beyond tactical adjustments. Officers like von Steinbach,
who had built careers on the premise that careful analysis could predict and control battlefield outcomes, found themselves confronting a more unsettling truth, that innovation could render any analysis obsolete within hours. General Major Hoffman, captured during the American breakthrough, later wrote from her prisoner of war camp, "We trained our minds to see limitations and obstacles. The Americans trained theirs to see possibilities and solutions. When we encountered a problem, we analyzed why it couldn't be solved. When they encountered the same problem, they invented ways to solve it. This difference in thinking determined everything." The American success in the Ardennes Forest became a case study taught in military academies worldwide, not because of its tactical brilliance, but because of its demonstration that the greatest strategic advantage lay not in superior resources or perfect planning, but in institutional willingness to abandon preconceptions when reality demanded new approaches. Colonel Frieda Brenner, whose intelligence assessments had confidently predicted American limitations, spent her final years after the war studying American military culture. Her posthumously published memoirs contained a remarkable admission. "We assumed that our 4 years of combat experience made us superior to American forces with less battlefield time. We failed to understand that while we had been learning to fight the last war better, they had been learning to fight the next war differently." The Ardennes breakthrough proved that military innovation could emerge from necessity rather than doctrine, from field modification rather than formal development, from the simple refusal to accept that problems were insolvable. American tank crews hadn't received years of specialized forest warfare training. They had received equipment and permission to modify it as circumstances required.
Von Steinbach's final testimony to the American investigators captured the essence of what the German military establishment had failed to comprehend. "You fought a war we had never imagined was possible. We prepared for the war we understood, but you brought the war that emerged from problems we couldn't even see. Our defeat began not when your tanks entered the forest, but when we decided that forest was impassable." The Battle of Waldberg stands as testament to a profound truth about human conflict and adaptation. The greatest victories belong not to those who perfectly execute existing plans, but to those who abandon their plans when reality demands better solutions. In that frozen forest, American forces proved that the only true impossibility is the failure to imagine new possibilities. The German officers who witnessed their certainty crumble in those December woods learned that warfare, like all human endeavors, belonged ultimately to those willing to transform problems into opportunities through the simple courage of refusing to accept limitations as permanent truths.